So as they go through a growing season and think about here in the United States with all the different crops that are grown in outdoors, you have several stresses. Several different sites pretty much come up to the same conclusions. You know, it's either too hot or too cold, too much rain, not enough rain, too much salt. And then the stress of the chemicals that they get exposed to through pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, those types of things. And then the biotic, which we've already covered. Here you're looking at a table from your book, looking at the different ideas here of, in general, what are some of these stresses doing to the plant. And so if you have drought, you can see that it messes with the water potential of the plant. Okay, so you're making the water potential of the soil very, very negative. And we know water moves from less negative to more negative. So you can actually get water loss out of the plant body under severe drought. And that would cause, of course, wilting and issues and potentially death. So salinity, though, it kind of does the same thing. It creates a very negative water potential in the soil system because salts are solutes that get dissolved in the water. So that's your psi sub S value of the water potential. So more solutes, it's more negative psi sub S. More solutes, more negative psi sub S. So you're driving your overall water potential more negative, again, if you have too many salts dissolved into the water of the soil. Here are some other ones. Flooding. Soil compaction is actually a struggle for growers to make sure that the soil is at the right kind of consistency and has the right kind of aggregation. You can often see when you have flooding going on, what tends to happen is the roots start to get starved of oxygen. It's just too much water in the soil. The plants, the roots get submerged for too long. They start to get starved of oxygen, essentially. Oxygen doesn't diffuse through water very well, so it becomes a real problem. And then you can see some high temperature or low temperature that starts to mess with membranes and protein stabilization. And freezing, of course, can actually cause cells to lyse and break open, cause actual tissue damage that can't get, that it doesn't recover. It either grows more tissue or it ends up dying. And then we'll talk about different elements. If you have toxicity of those, we'll get into that. And even too much light. We've talked a little bit about that already, that if the plant gets exposed to too much sunlight, it does have some defense mechanisms and ability to deal with it, but sometimes it reaches a tipping point and the plant can't do a whole lot with that. So some other terminology, acclimated, you might hear that quite a bit in the plant world. The more common or the everyday language, people will say hardened. They'll say you need to harden your plants off before you put them out in the spring. And you often hear that term. Acclimated is more what plant physiologists would say. And this is your process of getting your plant used to some stress. And like for springtime, especially around here, when we have a very cold winter, typically, you need to get them used to the cooler temps during the day and night at the start of spring. So you put your plants out for an hour, then you bring them back in, and then you do it again for a couple hours, bring them back in, and you just slowly get them used to these cooler temps, and you're acclimating your plant. And so then when you fully put it into the ground and start growing it full time outside, it is used to those temperatures and it's adjusted its physiology and its growth responses appropriately. Adaptation is different than acclimation because that's at the level of the DNA that we're talking about. And so that's usually a much slower process. Whereas acclimation you can do to that current plant within a matter of weeks or days even, depending on what you're trying to acclimate. Okay. So if you are growing plants for a living, it's probably one of the toughest jobs out there because you have to depend on figuring out Mother Nature. And here you can see there's a lot that gets thrown at plants if you grow plants outdoors. And you can see by the pie chart, drought wins. There's more impact with drought than any other stress. And the next one right after that is the exact opposite, too much flooding in the green here. So flooding and storms is the second most. All right. And so then you have cold, hail damage. And actually you see disease insects, according to this data set, is quite small, quite a small sliver. I kind of find that hard to believe, actually. Here's another source that has more up-to-date data. And this is focusing only on abiotic, but you can see drought wins again. And then the very next thing is just the opposite. Too much rain, too much water. And then hail damage, of course, when you have golf ball size hail raining down on plants, that's a lot of tissue damage that they can't often recover from. Okay, so you can see the amount of payments out. These are insurance payments going out to the growers after they have to deal with their crop loss. You can see that it can be quite significant. So this is always something that you are fighting against when you're growing outdoors. And then, unfortunately, more and more we have to be concerned about pollution, air pollution too. That's getting worse. And the idea here, when you think about what's in the air, certainly we have CO2 and we know that's going up, but that's not always a bad thing for plants in the sense that C3 plants actually benefit from that. So even though CO2 levels are rising, and most scientists say we don't really want that because that contributes to global warming, C3 plants, on the other hand, benefit from that. C4 and CAM plants, not so much because they're so efficient anyways that it doesn't really do a whole lot for them, but definitely C3 plants. But we have other carbon containing compounds like carbon monoxide that no organism does great with except maybe microbes. Sulfur compounds, nitrogen containing compounds. The X just means that there's several different flavors of nitrogen volatile compounds that can be problematic in too high of a dose. And ozone, even though you know that ozone's important, but that's the ozone way up, way, way, way up in the atmosphere. We're talking about ozone that's down at Earth level, where plants get exposed to it or humans. You don't want to get exposed to high levels of ozone. So if you have like a air purification system in your home, some of them sell ozone production as part of their air purification. I'd be really cautious about that. If you're going to run your ozone, run it when you leave the house. And then when you come back, you might want to, I don't know if they're on timers or not. I don't own one, but you just don't want it running constantly when you're home and getting exposed to ozone. I just don't buy those types. Ozone's not good for your health. Good for creating that barrier against too much sun energy way up high, but ozone's not good down here. And that's actually what's most damaging to plants, because when you have ozone in the atmosphere reacting with other molecules, starts to produce reactive oxygen species. And again, you don't want to be breathing that in because those are free radicals that in general, that's not good for us to get exposed to. So here's a example of ozone. So here you're seeing a reaction with nitrous oxide. And the HV with the squiggle means that it's ultra or, well, sunlight energy essentially. But probably the ultraviolet that's doing most of the reaction here. But basically you're seeing how you get, if you get this kind of reaction happening and then it reacts, the oxygen from that reaction or the oxygen molecule reacts with dioxygen, then you get O3, which is ozone. Okay. So in general, you have to think about, during the day, hopefully everything's going well where the plant can open its stomata. The C3 plants anyways, they're opening their stomata. And so you're going to have some of these air pollutants coming in. This is an example of a sulfur containing compound coming in. And you can get some very nasty sulfur compounds that react once they get brought into the plant. So H2S is hydrogen sulfide gas. That's poisonous to pretty much any living organism except for microbes. Some microbes are happy to use it and aren't bothered by it. But for plants, for animals, we don't want to get exposed to that. And so they'll try to get it out through their stomata as best they can. So certainly there's a lot more research going on toward air pollution. It's not as researched here in America because we've had the luxury of having pretty decent air quality over the decades. But you go into some other countries that aren't so fortunate and you, I mean, you have alerts all the time of just poor atmosphere conditions and they warn you to stay inside. And so they're predicting it's going to get worse unless we take real aggressive action against it. So I'm sure there's going to be more to that story. Other pollutants, some are organic in nature. So here is a list of some of them. TCE, trichloroethylene, is common in groundwater. PAH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, come from the petroleum processing. MTBE is an acronym that is actually a mixture of organic molecules that they put into fuel. PCBs, you've probably heard about those, polychlorinated biphenyls. TNT, which they use in dynamite, believe it or not. That's an organic. Microbes can actually break down TNT, just pretty bizarre. Anyways, most of these organic molecules can be broken down. Most of these can be, microbes are pretty decent at breaking these down. So the figure up top is the trichloroethylene, and then what is that one? I can't remember. Oh, that's TNT. And then the butyl methyl, the MTBE is being shown there. So you can see that some of them are more complex than others. So we'll talk a little bit about the idea that some plants have the ability to degrade organics too, not just microbes. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. There's also inorganic pollutants. So when we think about some of the elements out there, so like some of the fertilizers that get applied into farming fields, agricultural fields, those are primarily inorganic elements that they are providing to the plant with the goal to feed the plant, because we know plants need minerals, they need those elements, but if you overdo it, you end up with pollution events. Certainly mining activities will just deposit a lot of different minerals as they go through their mining activities. The military, the Sawyer Airport used to be K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base, very active Air Force Base. And so unfortunately that area is known to have some pollution deposited there. And it's persisting even though the Air Force Base has been shut down since the 80s, late 80s, I think. Well, inorganic elements really can't be degraded because they're in their elemental form. So there's like, can't degrade them. But there's some options. If a plant, for example, gets exposed to too much, one option might be is that they could tuck them away somewhere where they don't cause as much damage. So sequestering into some part of the plant body where it's not as much of a risk if it's builds up in that area. So maybe in the vacuole, or often you'll see like the edges of leaf tissue, like the actual blade of the leaf, you'll see the edges or the tip. They'll have like an accumulation there, and that's sometimes why you see those parts of the leaf starting to go necrotic first before other parts. It might be because of this issue. The other idea is that sometimes plants and their associated microbes can what they call stabilize the minerals by creating situations where they can complex them perhaps with other molecules so that they stay put better and won't get into the like the water table, for example, or get dissolved in the water where the plant takes them up. So there are some options like that. You've probably heard about heavy metals. And so these are the most damaging to living organisms. So here's some examples. There's quite a list. And some of these I'm sure you've heard about just in terms of human health as well. And so some of these on the list we need in our diet, but dose makes the poison. So if you get exposed to too high of a level of like say zinc or selenium, even though we need those in our diet, they can be harmful. A lot of the others here, we don't, well, manganese we need in our diet, but the rest of it, not so much. So again, could the plant potentially sequester these or somehow stabilize them so that they are not, they're no longer in just their pure elemental form, they're complexed with other molecules. So if the plant unfortunately takes up some of these, especially the heavy metals, what tends to happen is the plant will start to kick into reactive oxygen species as a defense mechanism against that because it's a stress. If they do experiments where they deliberately do this to the plant, they tend to see the ROS kick up, and then they see photosynthesis tends to take a hit pretty quickly. And then their basic physiology starts to slow down. So especially the action of their enzymes seems to really kind of get sludgy and slow. And you tend to see membranes start to get damaged at high enough doses. And if you start messing with membranes, you tend to get cell damage, cell lysis. And then eventually apoptosis is the famous or the scientific way to say cell lysis. You're breaking open the cells. So it just depends on the dose that the plant is getting exposed to, how aggressive this will hit the plant. Unfortunately, it's complicated, but what they're finding is that heavy metals can actually act as mimics to mineral nutrients that the plant actually needs. And obviously, if it's mimicking one of those mineral nutrients, then it gets taken up instead of the mineral nutrient. So they've done some studies where they can see that calcium and magnesium won't get taken up. The heavy metal will instead in place of it. And so obviously that's not going to work because if the plant tries to incorporate the heavy metal acting like it's calcium or magnesium, you're not going to get the resulting situation to work. So if you think about calcium, calcium is really, really important. It binds to this calmodulin protein. So some of these heavy metal mimics will do that instead. And so instead of calcium coming in and binding to calmodulin, it'll be the heavy metal. Well, then that calmodulin protein won't be able to do its job. Same with chlorophyll. If we know that magnesium is bound into the chelated in the center of the porphyrin head region of that pigment, which is hugely important for the plant, But if a heavy metal ends up there instead, obviously, it's not going to work for doing photosynthesis. So it's complicated when you have all these different minerals in the soil system, lots and lots of different minerals, including, and then you have organic compounds that are breaking down and getting recycled. It gets very complicated very quickly in terms of, I'm not going to go into the details because it's kind of gnarly when you start looking at how these heavy metals are kind of mimicking and replacing. So I just want you to know kind of the big picture idea here. If they have the uptake of these kinds of pollutants, these inorganics, they can try to essentially not take them up at all, which would be the best. So they block the uptake. Or if they get brought in and they can pick up on it early enough that, oh, I didn't really want that, they can essentially pump it out. And sometimes they'll say efflux, it'll get effluxed. But basically, when they say pump ions out, if they're in the ionic form, especially, when they say pump, they mean the plant typically has to use ATP in order to get this to happen. So it's definitely an energy cost. Sometimes, depending on the plant, it may just be okay with some level of these pollutants where it can just tolerate it. And it might be able to do that because it has enough enzymes up and running that can do something with these pollutants, or have enough antioxidants up and running that can help. It can try to compartmentalize the pollutant. So very often the vacuole is the choice. Stuff them in the vacuole so that they can't mess with all the lovely proteins and enzymes and other organelles in the cell. And again, going to the tips or margins of the leaves, or they can try to chelate it. That's another option. So there's a group of chelating molecules that some plants have. They're called phytochelatins. And basically that just latches on to the pollutant. And if it does that, then the pollutant can't be very reactive. It's kind of like when hormones get bound with a sugar, something like that, and then the hormone stops to work. It's kind of that idea where they'll chelate it with special phytochelatins, and that helps. A lot of these studies actually began with some plants that were famous for living in soil that's very toxic with pollutants. And so these plants are called hyper accumulators when they started looking at them and going, how are they surviving in soil that's so nasty? They started realizing that they're actually accumulating a lot of these pollutants. And it can be quite impressive, 20 to 30% of their dry weight. And so most of these studies are done with heavy metals. And so they wanted to know, how is the plant doing that? You know, if we have that much arsenic in the soil, for example, how does the plant not die? As you know, if you get exposed to too much arsenic, humans die from that. And what they were realizing is that the plant was sequestering, so they were able to put it into parts of their cells and tissues that were less dangerous. And they have special compounds. They're called organometallic compounds. And it's usually some kind of sulfur containing compound or amino acid. And then the heavy metal will bind with that. And then you have those or the phytochelatins. In general, the metals can bind to that. So this idea of the plant will look pretty healthy and grow pretty normally all the way through its life cycle, even forming flowers and fruits. Even though they have that much of the heavy metal in their dry weight when you look at it. So it's pretty impressive. This is just the general idea of the sulfur containing molecules And so you have that portion binding with the metal. Aluminum citrate, you see here, the citrate molecule is helping to bind up aluminum, which is toxic to any organism in high enough doses. So they've adapted these strategies of dealing with very strong high levels of pollutants. And so basically what it comes down to is that if the pollutant isn't bioavailable, then the plant can typically survive it. And that's really the crux of the matter. When we say bioavailable, whether you're talking about a human or a plant, what we mean is if it gets into, in this case, the plant body, if it's not getting used or interacting with cells in any biological way, then it's okay. It shouldn't really be a problem. And so you may know this term more for humans, like they'll talk about if you take, they'll advertise, if you take this particular brand of vitamin, it has high bioavailability. We've manufactured it so it has high bioavailability. What they're trying to say is if you take our vitamin, it will actually get used by your cells and tissues. You won't just pee it out and excrete it out, and it'll be wasted. Okay, so we need to think about that. If you have the pollutants in the soil, and if they're in charged form, then, well, they can be bioavailable. We know that. We know that you can have microbes releasing the cations off the soil. You have cation exchange going on. So you have all of these, especially the cations coming through cation exchange, so CEC, the cation exchange process. And if that happens, it gets dissolved into the water, and then the roots start taking that up. If there's some situation where you can create more of a hydrophobic setting in the soil, then you can get some of these pollutants to stay stuck onto the soil. And so, for example, PCB and PAH, they are naturally high in hydrophobic quality. And so they can stay on the soil. But if they get exposed to some kind of biosurfactant, which some microbes actually make in the soil, then it can get released into the water. And so just some actions in the soil system can actually cause some of these hydrophobic molecules that are staying attached to the soil, they can actually get released. And so an example might be, you don't need to know the actual thing, but one of them that they study a lot is rhamnolipids. And bacteria just kind of naturally produce them that hang out in the soil. They'll do that and it acts, it's kind of like a soapy substance. And so that can release the PCB and PAH off the soil. And then if you just get some other pollutants like soap from some pollution event, something that's soapy enough, it can also do that. And so the other idea is what if the pollutants are volatile enough where they can get up into the air? And then, of course, if the stomata are open, that might be an option. Or you also can get some organic molecules taken up by the roots, and then they'll go out through the stomata in their volatile form. And so that if they don't get changed at all and they just go out, of course, that doesn't really stop the pollutants. They're still around and causing issues. So you do have this idea of it. It really does depend on if the pollutant is bioavailable to the plant in some manner. It does depend on the soil. So if you think about if you have a more of a clay mixture of soil or a sand mixture, that can make a big difference. and just the general chemical nature of the soil. If any of you have taken soils, you know that soils can be very, very different in their ratio of all these different properties. And we know soil is a little bit acidic typically, and that's like the 5.5 to 6.5. And so you have to think about this too. You have to, if you're worried about any kind of pollution in the soil, you have to know the soil characteristics, the soil chemical properties in order to assess if, should we even grow plants in that soil? How worried do we have to be? What's going to happen to the plants? And understanding, of course, what we already talked about earlier in the semester with how, the cations are there on the soil, the negative ones are anything that's negatively charged just stays in the water solution and percolates down with the water. And so we've already had this information, but it's still something that you need to think about as you are assessing polluted soil. So this comes to the idea of, we do have lots of polluted areas and including agricultural systems, but even just thinking about all the pollution events going on outside of, agricultural fields, there's a lot of polluted soil. And so one idea is that this process of phytoremediation could help fix this problem. And so again, PHYTO, see that in science, it means something plant related. So this term is specific to the use of plants to try to clean up a toxic area. And this is primarily thinking about, the typical plant has its roots in the soil. So we're typically thinking about soil-based toxins and the action of the plant living there. So we know that plants take up all kinds of minerals from in the water of the soil. We know that they open their stomata and they have the potential to bring in some of these pollutants and maybe break them down or sequester them. And so the idea of using plants is, yes, we can use it to clean up soil, but potentially too in the air quality too, because they're taking in different components through their stomata and maybe breaking that down. But actually, the very first idea on how do we clean up toxic areas, they started out with bioremediation. That was the field of study that first came about. Phytoremediation came later. Bioremediation, if someone uses that term, traditionally what we're saying is microbes, and that's what came first. They had a much better grasp back when remediation efforts started. They knew a lot more about microbes and their abilities to break down really bizarre chemicals or sequester things really well. And so bioremediation was tried first with sometimes very good success. And then people said, well, what about plants? We could use plants too. And so when you think about it, when you use plants, I would argue, yes, the plants are doing their part, but it's also the microbes that associate with them that's doing also remediation, whether it be microbes in the rhizosphere right around the roots, for example. So you have all of those microbes that the plant is influencing with their exudates. They're able to attract certain microbes over others, inhibit some. And so you have all these coexisting microbes in the soil around the roots, but then you also have microbes in the plant, the endophytes, and they're known too to help with remediation. And then you have the plant itself. So it's really, when we say remediation with plants, you can't really ignore the microbes that come with them, that they're part of the process. And so you have to think about it kind of as a whole unit that are acting to do the remediation effort. So here's a kind of a visual trying to get at this idea of what could be happening in terms of the pollutant. Here is the red circle, and they're showing the stabilization idea. They're trying to show that somehow it's been chemically transformed so that it's not as reactive. Stimulation, phytostimulation, what they're trying to say here is that the plant exudates are encouraging certain microbes to act and do their degradation, remediation. And then you have phytoextraction, where they're saying the pollutant is taken up into the plant, it's extracted from the soil. Volatilization is pretty self-explanatory. The pollutant's taken up and may hopefully broken down to a less harmful form, but not always. And degradation, I guess, is getting more at that, where you get the plant, well, not necessarily volatilized. Degradation means that you have the plant breaking down the pollutant in some manner so that it's no longer a toxic substance. So on the next slide, it goes through these ideas. So phytostabilization, you have this idea where you change the nature of that pollutant, and it usually can end up creating a situation where it's not as bioavailable. It tends to make sure that it stays put better so that it doesn't get into the water and get leached out. Phytostimulation, that just means the plant is, basically the plant roots and the microbes are doing their thing. This is pretty common with the breakdown of hydrophobic compounds, like the PCBs and PAHs that like to stick to the soil. A lot of microbes can attack that. So if these methods are getting used, then if you imagine a bunny rabbit coming along and chewing, it's all kind of below ground. And so other organisms aren't going to get impacted. But we have to think about the idea that, if these pollutants get up into the plant, they're part of an ecosystem where that plant might be getting eaten by an herbivore of some sort, or pollinators. They've looked at heavy metals in nectar, for example, where the heavy metal can end up in the nectar that's being provided by the flower to reward the pollinator. And so there's these types of issues. The extraction idea, again, that's where you start to see, okay, it's coming up into the above ground parts. And certainly, yeah, if you just think about a bunny rabbit coming along and chewing on that, they could get a good dose. So it requires a lot of thought when you do phytoremediation. You have to look a lot at your site. You have to think about the ecology of the system. And, if you have a big fenced off site, I guess it's not as big of a deal. You could go ahead and run some of these above ground activities and not worry about, the herbivores coming along and getting a dose of toxins. The phytodegradation idea you tend to see with organic molecules. They can get broken down to a good extent. And then volatilization, you often can see happening as well. And then there's a new term out there. They call it hydraulic control, which is essentially the root system. You think about, and remember now, many plants, their root system is bigger than what you see when you look at their above ground part. And so you need to appreciate some root systems can be quite massive. And then also be aware, of course, that different plants have different root system depths and how far they go out away from the main stem. And so you have a lot of options, and they really do look at plants in terms of what's their root system like. That's a big factor when you look at phytoremediation. If you know your pollutants have the ability to trickle down with the water system in the soil, well, you're going to want to try to pick plants that have nice deep roots that can take up that water, hopefully the pollutant, and bring it up so that the pollutant doesn't end up going into groundwater. So when you think about what kind of plants should we use, you don't just think about what's the plant looks like above ground. And so you're really zooming in. When they say hydraulic control, they're really zooming into what kind of root system, how well does the plant go through transpiration, because of course that's the activity that's bringing in the water. So they look at root system and transpiration rates. And in general, if you think about, I don't know if I have that in the next slide or not. if you think about, I can't write down low. Toward the bottom though, under hydraulic control, you should think about transpiration rates, because the faster the plant transpires, the more rapid the water uptake from the soil. And that's contributing to this hydraulic idea that you're taking in the pollutants, breaking them down, and hopefully less will end up in the groundwater. And then with the root systems, you're just looking at this image is trying to get you to think, different plants have different types of root systems, different depths and surface areas. And so if you are looking for a plant, you want fast transpiration rates, fast growing, because then the more biomass it has, the better its ability to really make an impact on remediation. And so that's a good thing. It needs to be able to handle whatever contaminated site you're at. Obviously, you don't put a plant that can't handle that ecosystem into those sites because it won't be adapted to it. Certainly, you look at the plant morphology, especially with roots, but also like number of leaves, how big is its canopy? Do we need to, you want to pick something that will end up with high biomass in the end. Very often, you'll see studies published where if they pick a tree, it's often poplars. And that is because if you've noticed around here, when you have a young poplar sapling, they grow very quickly. And they have pretty decent deep roots. And so that has been a very popular plant. And I'll just end with also, of course, the surface area of the root system, depth and surface area. You want to look at how much surface area do all of these fine roots provide. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll continue on with that after break. And I hope you all have a safe drive to wherever you're heading and have a nice relaxing break. Oh, by the way, I'm still grading the essay portion. I should be finishing that up soon, and then I will let you know when they're posted.